Today we're talking rubric marines, Zangors and sorcery. What can the arcane Astartes of the Thousand Suns bring to the tabletops of 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Thousand Suns and doing a bit of an army overview, talking about what sort of choices make them strong in 9th edition, and some of the things most likely to be seen on the table in strong lists. In the video we'll be going over their core rules, some of their stronger special rules and options that might get picked a bit more, talking about their units, and finishing up with one competitive army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. In 9th edition, I think the Thousand Suns have actually been in a reasonably good spot since their Codex dropped. I think you could certainly argue that on release it's one of Games Workshop's weaker ones they've released in 9th edition. There still was a massive upgrade on their previous rules, and it has meant that while just about every second book that Games Workshop has released has wound up getting nerfed quite heavily, the Thousand Suns have avoided all that. I think they're quite a nice example of a Codex that Games Workshop has got right on the power spectrum, strong enough to compete, but not so bad that they needed to get toned down. Tournament-wise, they've had some moderate success, certainly somewhat hampered by all the incredibly strong stuff that Games Workshop has come out with, but now some of the factions have been toned down, like Harlequins, Custodes, and Tau. The Thousand Suns have got their Armour of Contempt buff, which is a really powerful boost to the faction, and I think overall it's looking fairly good for the Thousand Suns. I suspect they'll be seeing a bit more play, and I certainly think can be solidly competitive. They are certainly an army with big strengths and weaknesses though. Obviously their main one is their massively powerful and flexible psychic phase. You've got the option of piling on loads of mortal wounds, giving big units like the Terminators enormous defensive and offensive buffs, or getting around the faction's relatively slow movement with nice double movement or potentially teleport shenanigans. In terms of units, I'd argue that the strongest units are probably the Rubric Marines, Terminators, and the supporting characters, particularly with Armour of Contempt making them tougher. I think in general most strong lists are going to want a strong battle line of those, supported by all the psychic buffs that the Psykers can provide. As for weaknesses though, being so good at one phase does mean that everything else does tend to suffer a bit. The long range fire support choices tend to be a bit underwhelming compared with other codexes. A lot of the other units in the codex are kind of overshadowed by those core choices. There's a fair few datasheets that I think you just very rarely want to take in a strong list, and relying on psychic does have its own disadvantages as well. Anti-psyker abilities and loads of Deny the Witch will certainly give the Thousand Suns a hard time. The Abhor the Witch secondary certainly isn't all that great either. It can be a fairly easy source of points in some matchups. Going through the Codex's rules though, we'll start out with their core rules. Brotherhood of Sorcerers makes their psychic phase a lot more reliable. A universal +1 to psychic test helps so much. It means you're going to be casting hard spells fairly reliably. They're harder to deny when they go off, and you're more likely to get big results like Super Smites or a fair few of the Thousand Suns powers that need a 9+ to do something weird. For the Terminators and the Rubrics, they also have a couple of useful things in Objective Secured and the All Is Dust rule. All Is Dust makes them fearless and also gives them +1 to their saves versus damage 1 weapons, making even fairly high quality small arms pretty bad choices against Rubrics. That's particularly relevant at the moment as well, as it stacks very nicely with Armour of Contempt and Light Cover. Even if you had a damage 1 weapon with AP -3, if you're firing it at a Scarab Occult Terminator in light cover, then they're still going to be saving on a 2+. For the various tables of Codex rules, I think it kind of makes sense to start with the psychic powers, as they are so integral to the Codex. Here are perhaps some of the most likely things that you might see in Thousand Suns lists. Temporal Surge, the new warp time to allow a double move, is very likely to be represented. The Rubric Marines don't seem quite so slow when they're moving twice as fast towards you. A damage dealer sorcerer could go to town with spells like Tzeentch's Firestorm, Doom Bolt, Gaze of Hate, and Smite. Doom Bolt in particular is very threatening with that auto 3 mortal wounds. If you're layering defensive buffs on a big unit, particularly the Terminators, you can combine -1 to hit from Glamour with a 4+ Invul from Weaver of Fates, and Temporal Manipulation can also be good on a squad psyker, healing very tough models of their damage. For big shooting synergy, say juicing up a whole load of Inferno Bolters, you can get +1 to hit from Presage, +1 to strength from Warp Flamers, which you could use on the Rubric Marines, and +6-inch range from another psychic power, stacked on all the stratagem buffs that you can put on them. And Twist of Fate I think could be an interesting one to switch to for 1 CP in the right matchup. Having a psyker suddenly flex into a spell that can turn off your invuls is a very scary thing to have access to. The best thing about Thousand Suns is that you don't really have to choose too hard between these. Say with Araman and a couple of sorcerers and a fair few squad psykers, you can afford to have the vast majority of these active in your army. I think most Thousand Suns lists will take more than half of these spells along. As we'll see over the next few sections as well as the +1 to cast, there's also a whole ton of other ways to make the powers go off a bit more reliably. As for other rules sections, you get to choose which great cult of the Thousand Suns to draw from. Out of the options, my favourite are Time and Duplicity. Time is the one that has the spell to allow you to resurrect a model in a squad each turn. It can be very powerful just to add extra mass to the units, but also the extra movement towards charged targets can be nice on Terminators. And they also have a nice Warlord trait for a 9+, granting you an extra cast. I'd say on balance though that Duplicity is probably the strongest out of any of the cults though. Their power to teleport a unit round the board really helps with the Thousand Suns movement problems, though their Warlord trait to redeploy D3 units doesn't hurt either. Next up we have Kabbalistic Rituals, the point system that can allow you to do some psychic manipulation. Most lists will generate a fair number of these points almost by accident, so at the very least you should normally have 2 or 3 of these going off per turn. First up, the +1 and +2 to cast are really good for making the psychic phase reliable. It's great that you don't have to commit to them before you've cast, and say if you just fail a power by 1 point, then triggering that rule can be really nice to know that you're going to auto cast it if you invest the points. I think they'd always be potential ones to use, but other very nice ones are Malevolent Charge for just throwing in an extra D3 mortal wounds when you're casting a Witchfire. I feel like that one's near auto use for 4 points, it can add up to a fair few enemy casualties over the game. Echoes of the Warp is quite a nice one for a cheap psychic action to gain a command point, and there's a few others like double casting Witchfires, maybe Doombolt, or one to make sure that your psychic power can't be denied if it is very important and there's enemy psychers around. For character upgrades we have Warlord traits. There's a -1 damage one that's quite good on a Demon Prince, and a 3+ involve that you can trigger for 1 turn. Otherwise the psychic buffs are kind of minor but helpful. Being able to do psychic actions a bit better, or use double Kabbalistic Rituals on the same psyker, both potentially do have power. Otherwise for characters we have the Relics and Legion Command abilities. The Relics I think are actually a fairly balanced section. Usually I think I would want the Umbrellific Crystal somewhere in the list. That's the one that allows you to teleport the bearer and 1 infantry unit once per game. Again, redeployment's really powerful on a relatively slow army, and getting a massive amount of Terminators exactly where your opponent doesn't want them is really nice. Otherwise, in strong lists people do seem to take a fair variety of them. The Helm of the Demon Eye can farm some command points. The Athenaean Scrolls are a nice direct psychic buff, casting 1 spell on a 3d6 all game long. Eglehen's Orrery is quite a nice one for a core unit with shooting, ignoring modifiers and damage result modifiers. Not too bad with the amount of those going around in 9th edition. The Conniving Plate gives you a 2+ save and you can only allocate half the attacks towards the unit, again quite nice on a Demon Prince. And Incandium is a good one that you could include as a squad sergeant relic. Turns their weapon into a heavy flamer with AP -2, which isn't too bad for a command point upgrade. Finally for characters, as if that weren't enough, you can also use the Legion Command abilities on them, the points cost upgrades. For the Exalted Sorcerers, I think maybe the most interesting ones are Dilettant and Rahati. Dilettant lets you take 2 different relics on the same model to take a very stat character. Rahati allows you to cast another power, even if it just allows you to smite while doing your buffs, then that's no bad thing. A regular sorcerer could take Loyal Thrall to do a psychic action and also cast. That's pretty nice if you're trying to do secondaries and you don't want to sacrifice all their powers. And the aspiring sorcerers within the Scarabs and the Rubric squads can do one to do an action and shoot. Again, that's pretty powerful with secondaries while keeping up Inferno Combi Bolter. And there's also one called Ardent Automata, quite a nice one that allows you to heal a model in each command phase. I'd be quite tempted on that one on big units of Scarabs. Finally for stratagems, I'd kind of divide them into 2 halves. There's a whole bunch that just allow you to manipulate the psychic phase, 1 CP for an extra cast, 1 command point to cast while doing an action, 1 CP to do an extra d6 to deny the witch, and 1 command point to ignore perils if it's going to be problematic. I'd say perhaps one of the single most powerful and interesting ones though is the 1 command point to swap a power out for another. It means that provided you've thought ahead, you can always potentially have the absolute best power for the job in the right situation. As I mentioned, flexing into the one to turn off invul saves could be a really big power move, but it just means that you've got an enormous amount of options on your psychers open to you. It does feel like there's a bit of decision paralysis there, trying to remember all the spells that you could change to, as well as just the complex array of things that you have on the board. Otherwise, there's a fair chunk of other quite powerful ones more for units. For 1 command point, Ensorceral Infusion can give you an extra AP -1 when a vehicle shoots. That one's quite nice with Volkite Contemptors. For either 1 or 3 command points, there's Unwavering Phalanx, -1 damage for Terminators or Rubrics. With all the layered buffs and armor of contempt, that can be basically an auto-use stratagem on a 5 model unit. If it does make the difference between losing models on a single hit or 2 hits, then that's going to have enormous value. For 2 CP, a surprise +1 to wound in any phase can be really good. That's nice with Inferno combi bolters as well, particularly if they're strength 5, you'd be wounding even Imperial Knights on force. For 1 CP, we've got Warped Regeneration, cast on a 9+ to heal or regenerate a model within the same squad. Again, a potentially quite nice one to look out for on Terminators. There's 2 CP for Risen Rubric, allowing them to forward deploy at the start of the game if you want to get them down on a midfield objective early, and a 2 command point 1 for an intercept attack when the enemy arrives from reserves within 18 inches of you. Lots of solid options there, and you should have access to a fair amount of them, seeing as most Thousand Sons lists can easily make do with a single battalion and not have to pay any extra command points besides for relics or warlord traits. Moving on to talk units, and pretty much the most iconic unit in the Thousand Sons decks is the Rubric Marine, really quite solid troops that are annoyingly hard to remove from objectives, even more so if you happen to be able to get light cover on them. In general, I think they've got far more value for their defense than their damage. They could chip in a smite or a bit of high AP bolt fire, but in general I feel their main job is usually going to be holding backfield objectives, doing things like actions and psychic actions, and to get them around the table they're really quite a common place for people to put the Temporal Surge spell on them so they can get a double move out of them when they need to. Potentially they could be jumping out of Thousand Sons Rhinos as well, or if you wanted to go with a bit of a different strategy, you could load them all up with Warp Flamers, hit them with a +1 strength for Warp Fire spell, and perhaps teleport them across the table to blaze something away with lots of shots at high AP. Out of the troops choices, I do feel that they're the strongest by a fair way. They do tend to appear in most lists. At the moment though, the true stars of the Codex seem to be the Scarab Occult Terminators, as we've mentioned a few times. They're pretty much the heavy lifters of the Codex, and with Armor of Contempt buffing Terminators so much, they only got better at that role. All this dust, Armor of Contempt, and light cover if you get it, already make them kind of exceptionally hardy, and they do have objectives secured on top of that. When you take into account that they can have models regenerated by a couple of sources, get a 4+ invul and -1 to hit, and also use the stratagem for -1 damage whenever it matters, you can potentially have a pretty enormous anvil of Scarab Terminators that's not going to be shifted except with the heaviest firepower or damage. Their damage output isn't quite as impressive as their durability, but they're still really quite nice. A whole bunch of decent AP, damage to melee attacks will handle a lot of things quite nicely, and they're pretty much the ultimate unit for stacking all the shooting buffs together and then blazing away with up to 40 Inferno combi bolter shots, maybe a few of them traded out for Soul Reaper cannons, and with some Hellfire missiles thrown in too. You could easily have them hitting on 2s with Presage, reroll 1s to hit, boost them to Strength 5 with an Infernal Master, and give them +1 to wound on top of that for 2 CP. That little stack will be doing around about 13 wounds to an Imperial Knight, and that's not even accounting for Soul Reapers or missiles. Typically they want to be starting on the board for the most part, maybe one unit could deep strike to get to an annoying place. Stomping up the board supported by psychic spells and blazing away with Inferno bolters seems to be where they're happiest at. Moving on to the Warp Spawn and Hangers On, first amongst them we have the Zangors, who I'd argue the new Codex didn't really help out quite enough. They do have their own synergies within the Codex, particularly with the Shamans, but it just seems that it's not quite enough to compete against the Rubrics, and if you just want cheap chaff units to do actions, people often go for the Cultist over them. Standard Zangors aren't looking particularly strong at the moment, though they will shortly have a Warp Meld Pact formation coming out in a supplement, which may or may not help them a bit. Otherwise, the Enlightened can be useful to have a unit or two around, basically just as a very fast moving unit to throw onto objectives or become a nuisance. The Shamans are quite fast casters on their Discs of Tzeentch, though I'd say they're not usually as efficient as sorcerers for getting the psychic powers that you need. Perhaps the main reason that you might want to take a Shaman is for an overcongested HQ slot, or if you just don't quite have enough points to justify a sorcerer. Cultists aren't really expected to be doing too much in terms of damage or defense, but they're cheap chaff as a 50-point unit, pretty nice for just being expendable screens or sitting around on safe objectives, but they aren't really going to be adding all that much extra strength to the army. Probably my favourite unit out of this entire section are the Chaos Spawn, which I think work quite nicely for the Thousand Sons. They're pretty fast and cheap at 23 points, bring a fair amount of raw wounds to the table, even if they don't have any saves, and they can quite nicely bully lesser units that don't really want to be in close combat. In particular, Spawn work really quite well with the 4+ invul save from Weaver of Fates, sorry not as Glamour of Tzeentch as I wrote there. For For an already reasonably durable unit, that takes them to a place where they're really quite annoying to remove. Finally, for Warp Spawn, we have the Mutalith Vortex Beast, which does have okay toughness and a fair amount of wounds. Overall though, I think that these things are still really quite underwhelming, despite some big boosts in the Codex. They can do a few mortal wounds, allow you to access another stratagem or so, maybe best used as a distraction card effects type unit for your opponent to have to deal with, while the rest of your army gets what it needs to do done. The Thousand Sons vehicles are perhaps in a slightly weird place. The 5+ Invul save and Inferno combi bolters can actually be quite helpful as a boost to a lot of the things with a 3+ save. Certainly say in comparison to a standard Chaos Space Marine Rhino, the Thousand Sons Rhino looks a lot more threatening. But unfortunately a fair amount of the Thousand Sons motor pool just doesn't really fit in very well with their normal style of play, with all their layered psychic buffs and character shenanigans. I think the Rhino is still fairly standout though, a pretty great transport for 85 points if you take the additional combi bolter. It's putting out basically a squad full of rubric marines firepower, and it's going to be fairly hard to shift with armor of contempt and a 5+ invul. Some people do like to use them for their rubric marines, but I'd say the majority of people seem to prefer fielding them on foot. They're really quite tough just in their own right, so they don't really need the protection of the transport as much as some other units in 40k. And as a more durable unit, they don't really need the transport quite so much to deliver them to deal damage. I guess it's not terrible for the extra speed to get onto midfield objectives, but it's often just better to let Terminators or Spawn go for those. Or maybe if you need the rubrics to get there, you could either use Risen Rubric A or Temporal Surge. I think Contemptor Dreadnoughts are one of the more interesting fire support choices for Thousand Sons. The Volkite Contemptors can potentially do quite well with that AP-1 stratagem against targets it's relevant against. They do also pair pretty well with Eglaeon's Orrery as well, as that allows them to ignore damage -1 effects and have those 2 damage Volkites be a lot more effective against certain hard targets. Otherwise, Contemptors with las cannons and missiles certainly aren't too bad for a bit of long-range anti-tank. Most of the rest I'm a little bit less sold on. Hellbrutes I think are a bit better here than some other factions due to the 5+ invul, and they can take las cannons and missiles for a bit of anti-tank as well. Helldrakes don't really do much damage, but their vast movement can be kind of annoying and make them a utility piece. Vindicators are pretty tough to shift, have the 5+ invul, and can be another choice for sort of distraction card effects units. Forge Fiends aren't really too bad general purpose fire support, but maybe aren't quite as strong as the Contemptors I'd argue due to not having core. Mauler Fiends and Defilers are both kind of okay for the cost, though not standout I'd argue, and Land Raiders and Predators I think are still pretty bad. Finally, we get to one of the other really strong sections of the Codex in the characters. Thousand Sons are an army that you could easily be fielding 4 different meaty HQ choices and it not be a particularly bad idea. Most 2000 point lists are going to want something like 2 or 3 sorcerers I think, and the different types of sorcerers all have something quite good going for them. Typically, on a pure points efficiency basis, I think that the exalted sorcerers typically outcompete the regular ones. 10 points for +1 attack and +1 wound and a reroll 1's aura I think is well worth 10 points. I'd assume them to be your standard ones unless you have any good reason to take something else, but the regular ones do have their own advantages. They can be good for taking up less detachment slots, as they don't take one up if you've got an exalted sorcerer there, and you can upgrade them to that loyal thrall thing that allows you to do a psychic action and cast as well. The Terminator sorcerer I would have previously said was probably the weakest of the lot, but with Armor of Contempt his durability is now even better than before. I think it's certainly a pretty reasonable upgrade that you could consider on the regular sorcerer, plus 15 points to make him a fair bit harder to remove if he does get exposed. Then we have Ahriman, who is another very popular choice. His main disadvantage is not being able to take his own choice of Legion Command, Warlord traits or relics, but 3 powers that are almost guaranteed to go off with his rerolls is really solid, plus he can be fairly mobile with that disc. In addition to sorcerers, more lists than don't I think tend to take an Infernal Master along. Again, he's very efficient, essentially a sorcerer who swaps out 1 cast for one of his tutelary packs. The ones that I'd pick for him are the one for the single reroll later in the turn, which can be really good to go on rolls that you wouldn't normally be able to reroll, or the nice and reliable +1 strength to 1 unit's guns, an excellent part of the combo that can make Inferno combi bolters on the Terminators into really threatening weapons. I have seen Demon Princes taken a fair bit, though maybe they're a little bit less common than the sorcerers. If you want a fighty character in the HQ section, then they're where it's at though. Psychic powers, fast movement with wings, and I think some of the best upgrades for them are the Conniving Plate for halving melee damage at them and the 2+ save, -1 damage for the Warlord trait, and the Swelled by the Warp psychic power can be quite relevant on them, giving +2 strength and +1 attack. Finally, we come to Primarch Magnus himself, certainly the most powerful caster, with very strong melee as well, and if you can keep him alive for multiple turns, then it is potentially very strong. The main issue with Magnus is that he can't hide behind obscuring terrain, so it's going to be fairly easy to shoot, and for his enormous 450 point cost, his durability just isn't really all that good, even with his -1 damage and 4+ invul. The majority of the strongest lists opt not to take him, just because if you lose that many points early in the game, it could be a blow that you might not recover from, and you just might have been a lot better off with multiple other units that aren't going to get killed so easily. To round up, here's just one example of a current competitive army list, one that placed highly in a grand tournament just the other week. This one's a very Terminator and rubric heavy list, run by someone called Zalma, who took it to 5th at the Lemanic War GT in Switzerland. Not too bad going at all in an event with around 50 people. Perhaps the dominating force on the list are 25 Scarab Occult Terminators, each of them taking the maximum amount of Soul Reaper cannons, Hellfire missiles, and Temporal Surge, and one of the two big squads of 10 takes the Ardent Automata upgrade. That's the one that allows you to heal injured models each command phase. Otherwise, there's a trio of Rubric Marine squads, 2 of which take Soul Reaper cannons and all takes Temporal Surge again. They could be solid for securing battlefield objectives, or potentially using Risen Rubric, maybe with the cheaper squad if you did need to have one deployed forward. Then there's a cheap and fast unit of Zangor Enlightened with great bows, and one singular annoying Chaos Spawn, with the rest of the list's points all being ploughed into characters. In terms of the supporting sorcerers, we've got Araman on a disc with Glamour, Presage, and Weaver. He's pretty nicely set up to be buffing the Terminators, making them -1 to hit, giving a 4+ invul, and +1 to hit both at range and in melee. He's backed up by a Rahati Exalted Sorcerer on a disc. He's a lot more of a mortal wound damage dealer. He takes the Rahati upgrade for 3 casts, so he can cast Tzeentch's Firestorm, Doombolt, and Smite. And he's a Warlord with the Arrogance of Aeons and the Athenaean Scrolls. I believe the Athenaean Scrolls might well go on Tzeentch's Firestorm. It does quite a savage amount of mortal wounds if you can manage to cast it on a 9+. This guy could easily be averaging 8 mortal wounds in a single psychic phase, and perhaps even more than that if you use the Kabbalistic Ritual. Next up, there's an Infernal Master, again with Temporal Surge. He takes Glimpse of Eternity and Malefic Maelstrom, the rerolls and the damage boost ones, and he's got the Umbralific Crystal to allow him to teleport himself and a squad somewhere on the board. I guess most likely one of the big squads of Terminators. You will be able to teleport 1 unit each turn as well with the Cult of Duplicity power. That could basically be cast by any unit. Finally, for a last caster, there's a Zangor Shaman. He takes Temporal Manipulation, the 1/2 healer unit, and he's going to be extra good at winging around doing psychic actions with Seeker After Shadows, the Warlord trait that allows him to perform them on 3d6 drop the lowest. Could be a good one for running around trying to warp those objectives. Overall, it certainly looks like a solid and well put together Thousand Suns list. Tons of very well supported Terminators, backed up by a few useful objective securing units, and a whole ton of options with the Psychers, both powerful buffs and some devastating mortal wounds. So I think we'll leave that there for the Rubric Marines and the Sorcerers. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How have Thousand Suns been treating you in this edition? And is the new Armour of Contempt enough to make them compete against the top lists in the game? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying a lot of the videos on the channel, I just want to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.